It always starts the same way. You wake up feeling a little disoriented, not frightened, not panicked, just unsettled. There's a strange pressure behind your eyes, a flicker of a dream you can't quite grab. Something about a hallway, a door, a shape standing too far away to name. But it's not the dream that wakes you. It's something else. Your hand is damp, or the sheets, or the bathroom sink. You turn on the light, and there it is. Blood. Not a lot, just enough to notice. On your wrist, on your shoulder, in a streak across the mirror. But when you check yourself, there's nothing. No wounds, no cuts, no pain. You're fine, you always are, but the blood is still there. You clean it, you brush it off. You blame a scratch, a nosebleed, a dream you forgot. But it keeps happening, night after night, week after week. And slowly, something worse starts to settle in. A feeling that the blood isn't just unexplained. It's not yours. Across the world, scattered in old case files, obscure forums, hospital records and dream journals, this pattern re-emerges again and again. People waking up with blood that doesn't belong to them. No injuries, no history of harm. Just the quiet certainty that something followed them from the dream. Some think it's psychosomatic, a trauma response. Some think it's spiritual, a symbolic bleeding echoing from another life. But a few have gone further. They've tested it, tracked it, and what they found is stranger than anyone expected. Because the blood isn't just random, it remembers, and eventually, it starts to recognize you back. The earliest documented reports of this phenomenon aren't found in medical journals or paranormal archives. They're found in confessional letters, sleep diaries, and sealed reports that were never meant to be published. In 1894, a midwife in rural Austria began writing to her parish priest about a disturbing occurrence. She claimed she'd begun waking up with blood on her hands. Small amounts at first, smeared across her fingers or beneath her nails. There were no signs of injury, no pain, and she hadn't been treating any patients that day. What disturbed her most wasn't the blood itself, but the dream that always came before it. A dim corridor, lined with stone, and a voice that whispered a single word she could never remember upon waking. She scrubbed her hands raw, trying to remove the stains. But the next night, it returned. On the fifth morning, she woke to find her name written in blood across her window, on the inside. The priest dismissed it as hysteria. She was found 3 days later in a nearby stream. No wounds, just blood across her chest in the shape of a key. In the 1930s, a psychologist in Prague compiled a set of case studies under the working title, The Red Trace. It was never formally published, but one surviving section describes a patient who dreamt of a child calling for help from behind a locked door. Each time he had the dream, he'd wake up with blood on his feet. No injuries, just damp, red footprints across the wood floor. When they tried to trace it back to the source, it always stopped outside his bedroom, as if someone had been standing there bleeding. Reports continued to surface in isolated, unconnected pockets of the world. A man in Kyoto dreamed of drowning in red water. He woke to find blood in his ears. A woman in Argentina started painting strange geometric patterns after dreaming of a room filled with mirrors. One morning, she woke to find those same symbols drawn on her walls, in blood. None of it hers. Medical tests confirmed it didn't match her type. These stories were never given serious attention. The idea of blood appearing without a wound was dismissed as delusion, sleepwalking injury, or contamination. But over time, something changed. Patterns began to emerge. The blood only appeared after specific kinds of dreams that didn't vary much between individuals. They involved dimly lit spaces, long corridors, the feeling of being watched, doors that couldn't be opened, or ones that opened too easily. Often there was a voice, not loud, not aggressive, just present. Sometimes calling, sometimes weeping. always just out of sight. In the 1970s, a nurse in Louisiana began keeping her own records after treating 3 different patients who each came in reporting unexplained bleeding and memory lapses tied to dreams. None of them knew each other, but each one described the same setting: a hallway with red lights and the sound of dripping behind the walls. She sent the cases to a local psychologist, who referred her to a dream researcher at a university. That researcher's response was short: do not follow the dream back, and if the blood starts to form patterns, stop writing them down. This warning, repeated in other obscure documents, suggests a turning point in these cases. A shift from isolated anomalies to something structured, something with intent. The people experiencing this weren't injured, they were being marked. And slowly, the blood started to show signs of memory, forming the same shapes, the same symbols, across different lives, continents, and generations. Almost as if it were trying to show them something, or perhaps someone. By the early 2000s, the pattern had become harder to ignore. Small, online communities dedicated to dream analysis began collecting accounts from people who described nearly identical experiences, waking up with traces of blood, no signs of injury, and a lingering image in their minds, a place they'd never been, yet somehow recognized. The dream was always similar. A hallway, sometimes stone, sometimes wood. Low ceilings, a distant light, flickering like a candle through fog. At the end of the hall, a door. Tall, heavy, old. Locked, usually, but not always. Some described hearing a voice from behind it, familiar but not identifiable. Others never heard a voice at all, just the slow, rhythmic sound of something dripping. That's when the blood would start. At first, it was a smear on the hand, a spot on the shirt, a stain on the pillow. But soon, the placement began to matter. Several people reported waking up with blood across their lips, as if they'd bitten someone. Others found it in the shape of fingerprints on their chest, their legs, their face, like someone had touched them in their sleep. One woman in South Africa found a handprint in blood on her mirror. But it wasn't her hand. It was too small. Across forums, dream journals, and late-night messages that often ended with, "Please delete this after reading," a disturbing detail began to surface. Some people were sharing the same dream. One thread described it in near-perfect consistency. A corridor that narrowed as you walked. Walls that seemed to shift, breathe, or bend inward. A smell of copper. The sound of something being dragged. Not loudly, but rhythmically, as if being pulled along stone. And always, always a door. Sometimes they opened it, sometimes they didn't. But those who did all described the same thing on the other side. A room with no windows, a single chair, and something weeping. The blood that followed began changing. It no longer appeared randomly. It arrived with intent. Some reported seeing shapes drawn across their skin. Arcs, symbols, spirals, letters. But they faded too quickly to study. Others tried photographing the markings, only to find their cameras distorted the images. Or worse, refused to store them. One man said his photos turned to static the moment the symbols appeared. Another claimed the markings bled through onto his wall, and then disappeared completely the next day. Several dreamers attempted to track the blood. One used blacklight powder around his bed. The next morning, the footprints showed movement, toward the bed, not away from it. Another scattered salt across the floor and awoke to find it disturbed, not by feet, but by something that had crawled. Theories emerged. Some believed they were touching into someone else's death, a trauma echoing through sleep, bleeding into the present. Others believed the blood was a memory left behind by a spirit, a fragment of identity caught between lifetimes. But one idea took hold in the quietest corners of the internet, that the blood wasn't residual at all. It was alive. It remembered who it had touched, and it returned to those it recognized. That would explain the escalating phenomena. People seeing the same symbols, people dreaming in sync. One woman dreamed of walking through the hallway and found another person already standing by the door. She didn't recognize them until she checked her messages that morning. A stranger had sent her a DM at 3:12 a.m. "We were both there. I think it's my blood too." The dreams were no longer private. The memory was no longer isolated. Something was spreading. Not a virus, but a shared echo. A ritual that none of them agreed to join, but all of them had begun participating in simply by sleeping. And the blood was becoming clearer in its patterns. Not random stains, not smears, but messages. The dream is no longer just a dream, and the blood is no longer just a trace. Once the symbols begin forming clearly, everything shifts. People stop waking up confused. They wake up afraid. The blood no longer appears in random places. It chooses its location. A perfect ring around the ankle, a sigil beneath the collarbone, a spiral on the wall, drawn in precise, steady lines as if by a practiced hand. One man in northern Italy said the blood began forming a language, glyphs he didn't recognize, but which seemed to repeat themselves in patterns. He started sketching them after each dream. By the third week, he realized they were appearing before he slept, drawn across his windows in condensation, traced in the dust on his bookshelf. He stopped sleeping. The symbols didn't. Another woman in Quebec reported that the blood began pulsing faintly beneath her skin in the moments before sleep, as if anticipating its return. She could feel it move, rising toward her fingertips, her throat, her chest. She said it wasn't her blood anymore. It was theirs. When she asked who they were, her voice cracked. She hadn't meant to say they. It just slipped out. By this stage, dreamers stop referring to it as a dream. It becomes the dream. Singular, repeating, growing. Some report that the hallway expands, or that the door is closer now. A few say the door is already open when they arrive. Inside, the chair is no longer empty. One girl described seeing herself sitting in the chair, older, bleeding from the eyes, smiling faintly. She told her younger self to wake up before it remembers too much. She never dreamed again, but her parents found her writing in her sleep, pages filled with blood-red ink. She didn't own a red pen. These aren't accidents. These aren't hauntings. They are interactions. The blood is responding, learning, remembering, and it starts to show up while you're awake. A man in Berlin reported seeing a smear across his rear-view mirror in daylight. The same shape that had appeared on his chest in a dream the night before. He checked himself. No wounds, no blood. But when he wiped the mirror, the stain returned 5 minutes later. Identical. Another dreamer claimed the blood began appearing on other people, friends, co-workers, even strangers, all marked in places she'd seen in her dreams. She recognized them, though she'd never met them. Some looked at her with a flicker of recognition, others just stared. And then came the message, written on her bathroom wall in dried streaks. "We remember you." The concept of blood memory isn't new. It appears in myth, folklore, and ancient medicine. Some cultures believe that blood carries not just life, but experience, that it stores grief, desire, even knowledge. But what if it does more than store? What if it searches? Some now believe the blood is a kind of vessel, a messenger sent through dreams to recover something that was lost. A name, a location, a truth that was buried too deep for memory, but not too deep for blood. One dreamer woke up with a perfect circle of blood around her eye. Not a cut, a ring. Inside it, drawn in the condensation of her window, was the phrase, "You're getting closer." The markings intensified. Some saw scenes in the blood. flickers of people they'd never met. One woman recognized a house in her dreams and later saw it in a missing persons report. Others began speaking words they'd never learned, in languages they didn't understand, upon waking. The blood was no longer passive. It was bringing something back. But perhaps the most chilling realization came from those who stopped dreaming entirely. They were relieved at first. No more blood, no more messages, until they saw the markings return on other people. And one day, someone turned to them and said, "You left something behind." Because once the blood remembers you, it doesn't need permission. It doesn't need a wound. It only needs recognition. And the moment you see the shape again, the dream will pick up right where it left off. Not every scar is earned. Sometimes it's inherited. Sometimes it arrives in the night, carried by something older than memory and quieter than pain. And sometimes it shows up in the form of blood, not because you were wounded, but because something else was, and it wants to be known again. By now, you've probably asked the same question everyone else has. If the blood isn't yours, then whose is it? But maybe that's not the right question. Maybe it's not about who bled first. Maybe it's about what was left behind in the blood itself. A signal, a map, a name trying to find its way back to a body that no longer exists, or one that no longer remembers what it once was. So what would you do if you woke up tomorrow and saw it? A smear on your mirror, a symbol on your arm. No wound, no pain, just that same cold sense that something touched you while you slept. Would you clean it up or follow where it leads? Tell me in the comments, have you ever woken up with blood you couldn't explain and a dream you couldn't forget? And if this story felt a little too real, like something your own body half remembers, then like this video, subscribe for more, and come back with me to the forbidden. Because some blood carries more than memory, it carries messages, and the next one might be for you.